Now, there were a couple other things that these alternative accounts said, one of which it said that you argued during the debate that, quote, the current arguments used by ID advocates are awful and ineffective, unquote. Is that an accurate characterization of what you said during the debate?
No, if I certainly don't recall saying that. If I did say that, it wasn't an accurate reflection of my views. I think what the author is referring to is a time where I made a conditional claim. I was trying to argue that intelligent design can count as science, and we shouldn't use the criterion of methodological naturalism to exclude intelligent design. And I think I made the conditional claim that even if the intelligent design arguments are ineffective in the way the author described, it doesn't follow that intelligent design isn't science or that methodological naturalism is true. Philosophers often have this problem that we will blithely make conditional claims and then people will assume, they'll forget about the if part of it and then just assume that we're asserting the then part. And I try to be careful in public context to make clear exactly what it is I'm saying and not saying, but obviously sometimes people aren't following.
Well, I can appreciate maybe the confusion that this ID skeptic apparently had. I make a rule to never get in arguments with philosophers because they make very complicated, nuanced arguments that you really have to be tracking closely to refute them. And philosophers tend to be pretty smart people. Another interesting comment that this guy said is he called you the classic refrain idiot, of course. But he finally said that, quote, the less said about Dr. Montan, the better. Quite frankly, I'm sure he's a nice fellow, but he had as much relevance to discussion as an expert in 17th century French poetry, unquote. The implication being, of course, that in the 17th century is when philosophers and scientists decided that the whole design hypothesis was not scientific, and that if you are maintaining that ID should be taken seriously, then you belong back in the 17th century. Now, the question is, who is out of date? Is it you, or is it or those who are claiming that philosophers of science would use criteria to rule ID out of science?
Yeah, I think that the people who are trying to implement these questionable demarcation criteria are the ones who are out of date. And more generally, the interesting thing about that move that the person you're talking about makes is, the less said about Dr. Montan, the better. Actually, I think I gave lots of trenchant, arguments that are worth serious consideration against, for example, Lawrence Krauss, who that author is on the side of. And so just saying, well, let's not talk about what Dr. Montan said is, kind of missing, the crucial force of my arguments.
I think that obviously this gentleman is experiencing some cognitive dissonance because you don't fit into his paradigm of the way the world is supposed to be. And so the less said about you, the better. I personally think we should say the more said about you, the better, but that's just my personal opinion.
Exactly. And this raises an interesting point. There was a group of people there at the debate who were from basically the local free thinkers group, the atheist type group in Fort Worth in Dallas. None of them talked to me afterwards. There was a group of them talking to another speaker, and I actually walked up and listened for a while and sort of made eye contact with a few of them, and they didn't say anything to me. And you would have thought they would have been intrigued to talk with me, but no.
Very interesting. Well, maybe to them you're an apostate. I'm not sure. Just by being there, participating. I've had many experiences with folks involved with these skeptic societies and these atheist groups, and by and large, actually, they're really nice people. I've had some wonderful experiences interacting with these kind of folks, and actually have built some really neat friendships over the years having these kinds of experiences. And I'm sure that you certainly have no problem interacting with folks from these skeptics groups and so forth.
Right.
So it's too bad they didn't want to talk to you. Maybe the less said about you, the better. They were trying to live by that rule. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the debate? It sounds like it was a very interesting afternoon and then the next morning as well.
Yeah, it was. There are other interesting issues that came up. The interesting thing about Dennis Alexander is that he's not a deist. He doesn't think that God set up the world and then just let it go into motion. He thinks that God continuously is active in the world. And you might think that that's very conducive to the intelligent design line of thinking about biology. But he tried to portray intelligent design as a God of the gaps argument, that basically most of biology works fine via standard naturalistic evolutionary processes, but occasionally for things like the bacterial flagellum or for blood clotting, God comes in and plays a role. And he thought that he had problems with that line of reasoning. I tried to argue with him and suggest that intelligent design isn't even running a God-to-gap type argument at all. And the one way to make that point would be to say that, and maybe this isn't true for all intelligent design proponents, but I could see some intelligent design proponents saying that God does constantly play a role in the world and is constantly involved in evolutionary processes, but it's only sometimes that we can get good evidence that God is involved in those evolutionary processes. So the issue isn't that God is sometimes intervening in the world. God's always intervening. The only question is, when can we get evidence for God's intervening? And then the bacterial flagellum and blood clotting examples would be examples where the intelligent design proponents would say it's pretty clear that we are getting evidence.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that one of the main arguments of ID is that this is not about having a theological doctrine of creation that says that this is, an overall scheme of how God interacts with the world. It's about detecting design when we can detect it. And as far as theology goes, ID proponents very well may have theological views that say that God is always interacting with the world, and sometimes in ways that we can detect, and sometimes in ways that we cannot. But as far as the science of ID goes, I think you make a good point. We're not going to try to claim that there's some intelligent agent behind everything, whether it's detectable or not. That's not what the science of ID is going to claim. It's going to claim that we detect design when we can detect design. And This is not about having some overarching theological doctrine of creation or how God interacts with the world. That's fine if you want to do that, but that's theology and that's not ID. ID is a very different project. So I think you make some very good points there. I'm going to finish this up with just a short little sound off of myself. You might call this Casey's thoughts, analogous to Jerry Springer's thoughts on the Jerry Springer Show that he always ends his show with. And that is this gentleman who critiqued the debate, saying that this was basically all just a conspiracy by Discovery Institute, who was paying for all of it and paying people to say certain things. And this is all just people at the high levels pulling the strings, paying people to say certain things. The problem with conspiracy theories, and this goes for any kind of conspiracy theory, is that they almost always assume that the average person is not behaving as a rational agent, that they're always the pawn of some higher force, or that they don't have actual minds and intelligences themselves that they're using to and exercising to come up with their own viewpoints, and they're always the pawn of some higher level unseen force. That's really a travesty of a position to hold when you're dealing with intellectual debates where people clearly do have their own intellectual positions, such as Professor Monton or Berlinski, and the whole notion that people just say things because they're being paid to say things. These kind of conspiracy theories don't fit with the reality that people are rational agents that have their own views, and they make up their own minds and make their own arguments. We see these kind of conspiracy theories a lot in this debate, the idea that Discovery Institute is watching your every move and we're pulling every string. We laugh at these kind of things here, because if we were a tenth of it as influential as our critics thought we were, gosh, who knows what we could accomplish. But the bottom line is that there are people out there in the real world, whether our critics like it or not, who independently think ID is a really good idea, and think that academic freedom should be protected, and think that philosophy of science should not be ruling out ideas a priori, and think that there is empirical evidence for ID in nature that deserves to be published in scientific journals. This is not a conspiracy on the part of Discovery Institute. This is the power of an idea, and there are a lot of rational agents out there, intelligent people who have independently come up with these views. And I think that when our critics used conspiracy theories to try to, just claim this is all a conspiracy of Discovery Institute, they're only going to get very far with folks who already have some kind of bizarre obsession with attacking Discovery Institute as it is. Anyway, that's Casey's thoughts for the day. And Professor Monton, we appreciate your time and the time you spent doing this debate and being on our show today.
Thanks, Casey. And yes, regarding your thoughts, I just want to reiterate that I'm not a pawn of anyone saying what I think, and that's what I've been doing as a philosopher for many years, and just recently I've gotten interested in the intelligent design debate, and there's nothing special or different about the way I'm treating the intelligent design debate than the way I've treated any other intellectual issue I've gotten involved in.
Well, we wish you the best, regardless of what direction you go in the debate, that you will just have academic freedom to continue to produce and explore your views, Professor Monton.
Thanks, Casey.